The studio lights were brighter than usual that night, not because the producers wanted drama, but because they expected control. Bob Marley sat quietly in his chair, hands resting loosely in his lap, eyes calm, unreadable. Across from him sat one of the most respected television hosts of the era, a man known for asking questions that sounded polite but carried sharp edges underneath. Millions were watching. This was live television. No edits. No second chances. The host leaned forward slightly, adjusting the papers in his hand, then looked directly at Bob with a measured smile. "Bob," he said, "people hear you speak about Rastafari all the time, but very few truly understand it. So tell us clearly and simply, what is Rastafari?" The question sounded harmless, but Bob did not answer. Not immediately. A strange stillness settled over the studio. The audience shifted in their seats. The host waited, still smiling, expecting a quick explanation, a few spiritual phrases, something neat enough for television. But Bob remained silent, his eyes lowered for a moment, not in fear, not in confusion, but in thought. The cameras stayed locked on his face. The silence stretched far longer than anyone expected. 10 seconds passed. Then 15. In the control room, producers exchanged nervous looks. This was not in the rundown. Live television was built on momentum, on constant sound. Silence was dangerous. The host cleared his throat lightly, about to repeat the question, when Bob slowly lifted his gaze. Still, he did not speak. That silence was not empty. It was heavy, because Rastafari was not a slogan. It was not a definition. It was not something Bob could compress into a sentence for an audience that might already have its mind made up. Outside the studio, newspapers had already framed the narrative. Rastafari was misunderstood, mocked, reduced to hair and music and rebellion. Many watching at home expected Bob to stumble, to struggle, to expose what they believed was a shallow belief system. Others expected him to preach, but Bob did neither. Host shifted again, his confidence wavering slightly now. The audience sensed it too. Something had changed. The power in the room was no longer controlled by the questions. It was controlled by the silence. Bob Marley was not refusing to answer. He was deciding how much truth the room was ready to hear. And in that pause, every assumption about Rastafari, about Bob, about who held authority on that stage, began to crack. What happened next would not only redefine the interview. It would expose the limits of television itself. Asterisk finally broke the silence, but his voice no longer carried the same confidence it had moments earlier. "Well," he said with a small, uneasy laugh, "take your time, Bob. We're live, but there's no rush." The audience chuckled politely, but the laughter felt forced. Something had shifted in the room, and everyone could feel it. Bob Marley did not smile. He leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes scanning the studio lights, the audience, the cameras. For a brief moment, it felt as though he was not just looking at the room, but beyond it, as if he were weighing decades of history, pain, misunderstanding, and belief against a single television moment. This was not just a question. It was a test. Rastafari had been debated, mocked, and distorted for years. Newspapers called it dangerous. Politicians dismissed it as primitive. Television often treated it like a curiosity, something to be explained and then safely set aside. And now, in front of millions, Bob Marley was being asked to package it neatly, to translate something deeply spiritual into language that would not make the audience uncomfortable. The host shifted in his seat again. He glanced briefly toward the camera, then back to Bob. "Many people watching tonight," he continued carefully, "see Rastafari as a lifestyle choice. Some see it as a protest movement, others, frankly, see it as a misunderstanding of religion altogether. Bob's fingers tightened slightly, then relaxed. Still no words. The silence returned. Heavier than before. In the control room, the director whispered urgently to a technician. The red light above the main camera stayed on. Cutting away would only make it worse. At home, viewers leaned closer to their screens. Some were confused, some were irritated. Others felt something they couldn't quite name. This was not dead air. This was confrontation without noise. The host tried again. His tone now edged with pressure. "Bob," he said, "you've built an international career. Your music reaches people far beyond Jamaica. Don't you think you owe them an explanation?" That word hung in the air. Bob's jaw tightened for just a moment. Anyone watching closely could see it. For years he had been told what he owed. Owed record labels. Owed governments. Owed audiences who loved the music but questioned the message. The audience waited for him to push back, to argue, to defend himself. But Bob Marley did something unexpected. He closed his eyes, not dramatically. Not for effect. Just long enough to breathe. In that breath was Trenchtown, his mother, the sound of drums in the distance. The elders who taught him that Rastafari was not about convincing anyone, but about living truthfully. The host noticed it, too. His pen stopped moving. His prepared notes suddenly felt useless. Behind the scenes, a producer whispered, "Is he okay?" Bob opened his eyes. He looked directly at the host now. Not angrily. Not submissivel. Why? Patiently. The kind of look a teacher gives a student who has asked the wrong question. Not out of malice, but out of ignorance. People think silence means weakness, Bob finally said. His voice low and steady. The studio froze, but then he stopped again. The host blinked, unsure if more was coming. Bob said nothing further. The audience shifted, confused now. Was that the answer? Was he finished? The host leaned forward instinctively. "Go on," he said softly. "What do you mean by that?" Bob Marley's gaze drifted back to the audience, to the faces. Some skeptical, some curious, some already judging him. "This is live television," the host added, almost pleading now. "People are listening." Bob's lips pressed together. Briefly, he nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the reality of the moment. "Yes," he said. "They are listening." Again, he stopped. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer awkward. It was deliberate, controlled. In that quiet space, something uncomfortable was happening. The audience was being forced to sit with the question themselves. What is Rastafari? Is it something that can be explained in a sentence? Or is it something that exposes how little we listen when answers don't come easily? The host glanced toward the camera again. This interview was slipping away from him, not through chaos, but through restraint. Bob Marley had not raised his voice, had not challenged anyone directly, and yet the entire structure of the conversation was collapsing. Because for the first time that night, the power did not belong to the man asking the questions. It belonged to the man deciding when and whether to answer them. And the longer Bob waited, the clearer it became. When he finally spoke fully, nothing in that studio would remain the same. Bob Marley finally leaned forward, not aggressively, not dramatically. Just enough for the microphone to catch his voice clearly. "When people ask me to explain Rastafari," he said quietly, "they usually already want it to fit inside something. They understand." The studio was silent, not a cough, not a shuffle. Even the host had stopped moving. "But Rastafari," Bob continued, "is not something you fit inside words for comfort." He paused again, but this time the pause felt different. It was no longer resistance. It was invitation. "Rastafari is the memory that was beaten out of our people," Bob said. It is the reminder that we were something before we were told. We were nothing. The host's expression changed. The confident broadcaster was gone now. In his place sat a man listening, genuinely listening, perhaps for the first time that night. Bob's voice never rose. That was what made it powerful. When my people were taken from Africa, he said, they were stripped of their names, their language, their history. And when you take those things, you don't just take freedom, you take identity. The camera slowly zoomed in on Bob's face. His eyes were steady, but there was something beneath them now. Pain, memory, truth. So, Rastafari, he said, is remembering who you are when the world profits from you forgetting. The audience did not applaud. They didn't dare. This is why it makes people uncomfortable, Bob continued, because it does not ask permission. It does not beg for acceptance. It simply exists. The host swallowed. His notes lay untouched. On the desk, you see, Bob said, turning slightly toward him. Television wants answers that can be wrapped up before the next commercial. But some truths don't work like that. A murmur rippled through the audience. Not agreement, recognition. For some people, Bob said, Rastafari is just hair, or music, or rebellion. A faint smile touched his lips, but it carried no humor. But for us, he said, it is survival. The host finally spoke, his voice softer than it had been all night. People watching right now, he said, might say this sounds political. Bob nodded. Everything becomes political. He replied, when it reminds people they are equal. That line landed like a weight. Bob leaned back now, his posture relaxed, but the room felt tighter than ever. I didn't stay silent earlier because I didn't know what to say, he continued. I stayed silent because I was deciding whether this space was ready for honesty. The host did not interrupt, and silence, Bob said, is also part of Rastafari. Because when you have been shouted over for centuries, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to rush. The audience began to understand that first silence had not been emptiness. It had been a mirror. Bob turned his gaze outward, past the host, past the cameras, as if speaking directly to the people watching from their homes. Rastafari does not ask you to convert, he said. It asks you to look, to really look, at injustice, at suffering, at the systems that teach you who deserves dignity and who does not. The host exhaled slowly. His shoulders dropped, and if that makes people uncomfortable, Bob added, then maybe discomfort is the beginning of truth. For a moment, no one spoke. Then something unexpected happened. The host removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the desk. I asked you to explain Rastafari, he said, his voice unsteady but sincere. What you've done instead is explain us. Bob looked at him, not triumphantly, not smugly, just kindly. That is all Rastafari ever tried to do. Bob said. The audience stood. Not all at once. Not on cue, one person, then another. Then an entire studio, rising into a quiet standing ovation. Bob did not bow. He did not raise his hands. He simply nodded once, respectfully, as if acknowledging something larger than himself. The broadcast ended shortly after. No dramatic closing line. No theme music swelling. Just a host thanking Bob Marley for being there. His voice still carrying the weight of what had just happened. But the real impact came later. Newspapers the next morning didn't know how to frame it. Some called it uncomfortable. Others called it profound. Many simply described it as the night television fell silent. Clips of the interview were replayed again and again, especially that first long pause. Communication professors studied it. Activists referenced it. Religious leaders debated it, but among Rastafarians, the moment became something else entirely. It became proof. Proof that their faith did not need defending with anger. Proof that silence could carry truth louder than argument. Proof that dignity could disarm misunderstanding. Years later, when asked about the interview, Bob Marley shrugged gently. Sometimes, he said, people don't need answers. They need space. That night, on live television, Bob Marley didn't explain Rastafari the way the world expected. He showed it, and the silence that followed spoke louder than words ever could.